Recently, I read in a newspaper article, okay, we're going through a global financial crisis, right? Everyone knows this. Everyone's feeling it, I think. But recently I read in a newspaper, I saw some published research. It was in the marketing pages of one of the big newspapers here, the Sydney Morning Herald. And it's basically said that greed is a spent force, right? Greed is a spent force. Now, this is a really, very important and big comment to actually make. And there had obviously been some focus groups conducted, and there'd been some quantitative research conducted, and this was the outcome for all the researchers was that greed is basically now a spent force. So they proved it by doing the groups and by doing the questions and so on. Now, I apologise for being so blunt, but I mean, that really is a misunderstanding of what actually drives consumption, right? And we've really got to understand that before all this research was done, right, we're in a recessionary environment. Why did we really need to do all of that research? So you can imagine the amount of time and money, right, and effort that was spent coming up with that answer, which is actually a very dubious answer, that greed is a spent force. Now, we could have told you that before we did any research whatsoever. It's common sense. When you're in a recessionary environment and everyone's feeling it, naturally people are going to be saying, there's a contraction of spending. I'm not spending as much, I'm afraid, etc., etc. But that does not mean that greed, and greed's a bad word, I just call it consumption. That doesn't mean that consumption is a spent force. Now, look at actually what's happening around the world. We've entered a recessionary environment because of the amount of debt that we have accumulated. Now, why have consumers accumulated so much debt? Because, at least in the Western world, we've all been busy consuming, right? We consume everything. Consumption is a very powerful force, and we'll explain this in a minute. But what is the answer to a lot of debt, according to all the governments and banks around the world? Hello? Even more debt. So not just a little bit more debt, but a lot more debt. We are multiplying the debt in order to get out of debt. Now, a lot of economics commentators are looking at this saying, how can this happen? This is ridiculous, this is silly economic policy. But it is not silly economic policy. It's actually an economic policy that is based on a very pure understanding of the human being. And that pure understanding is that unless the human being continues to consume, right, and I don't just mean eating, right, by consumption we mean, look, the human being consumes everything. We eat, we drink, we consume music, we consume love, we consume sex. We consume basically everything because consumption is a driving force. Now, this is why we have recessions. We have recessions because we fear that consumption is going to dry up. So we've got to stimulate that consumption again and again. And we keep having to stimulate consumption because consumption, or human consumption, is the most powerful force on the planet today. Let's face it. Now, it continues unabated, right? It continues with an alarming speed. We consume everything, right? We consume everything that we see, books, TV programs, the lot basically. There is literally nothing that the human being or the consumer does not consume. That's why we call ourselves consumers, because we basically consume everything. Now, the market for human consumption may, due to some global circumstances today, to the naked eye may appear as diminishing. There's a contraction, but nothing could be further from reality. This is crazy. Consumption actually has very little to do with money. Our consumer society has linked consumption with money. So I guess over many, many years, corporations have been very clever in the sense that they have attached money and later on debt, right, in the form of credit cards and so on, to everything that we consume. Right now, this is a tactic which is meant to link financial well-being, or you might say the greed of banks or whatever. I don't necessarily agree with that, but you might say it's greed, to link that with the human desire to constantly consume. But consumption has very little to do with money. Even when we had no money, we consumed, and we consumed as much as possible. Why do we consume as much as possible? Because that is one of our strongest impulses. It's our strongest impulse because it's about our reptilian brain, right? That reptilian brain, the smallest part of our brain that we'll explain later on, gives off this force. It actually basically wants more of everything, more all the time. So it's a very avaricious kind of force, and it's just basically never ending. We want more of everything. Remember that Jerry Seinfeld episode where Jerry Seinfeld's sitting in first class, right? Due to these circumstances, and he's so overjoyed to be sitting there, and when they ask him if he wants something, he basically says, yes, I'll have more of everything, right? Now, and which was actually a very funny line, and it's a very funny line because it's basically true. in that one comedic line, he's actually encapsulating something very, very true about the human spirit, which is why he's a very popular comedian, because that's what they do. They capture something true about who we are and what we do, right? So there may be a small contraction, that is visible only to the naked eye, but really underneath, our consumption just continues unabated. This actually has a lot of consequences, believe it or not, for the way that certain policies in politics are marketed. Let's look at a big one. Let's look at global warming. What do we call it? We call it now climate change, right? And I don't know if you'll realise, but the word climate change superseded the word global warming because of linguistic research done for the White House many, many years ago. So we call it climate change. I call it global warming, whatever, right? Now, this is not about the science, right? Regardless of whether you believe it or not, regardless of whether you believe the science supports it or refutes global warming, this is not the point. The point is, for a politician, for a political party, for a government, for a world government, how do we sell the notion of global warming to the consumer? And it's actually contracted in importance. Recent measurements have shown that global warming is not really high on the priority agenda. I'll tell you why. Well, I'll tell you why I think it is the case, is because it's not been sold to us in the proper way. It's been sold to us in a way, it's been sold to us like a diet is sold to people, right? So when people say, oh, there's going to be a carbon tax and we want less of everything, that's what this carbon tax is all about. That's what global warming is all about. They're actually telling the consumer, oh, we've consumed too much, now we've got to start consuming less because our planet's overheating. Literally, it's overheating because of our consumption, right? This is how powerful human consumption is. We can overheat an entire planet from our consumption. Now, that rationally sounds terrific, right? But they're not dealing with the basic human emotion. Now, when you tell a person that you need to consume less, the initial emotion that comes out of that is anxiety. I feel very, very nervous when you tell me that I can't consume as much as I've been consuming, because that consumption basically makes me a bit happy, right? Oh, it actually makes me a lot happy some of the times. So if you're telling me I have to consume less, you're actually not promising me happiness at all. You are promising me anxiety. So it really is akin to dieting. It's about fear and anxiety. Now, we can't sell global warming, and I use the word sell, right? I'm not talking about the science of it or the reality of it. I'm talking about the marketing of something like global warming. We can't really sell global warming properly if we're going to tell people that they've got to do less of what they've been doing. That's wrong. We cannot respond to that. We will not respond to that well. We might do it. There might be legislation that forces us to do it, but it will never, ever be a popular policy amongst the electorate, right? So one thing that we can be sure of is that consumption is never ending, and we've got to actually formulate policies that play to that notion of consumption, right? Because without consumption, we don't exist, right? The human being who doesn't consume doesn't exist, right? All animals do not exist without consumption. So when you say we've got to consume less, you're not promising us life, you are promising us death, right? And that's what creates the anxiety. It's about the life and death struggle. You can't sell things by promising death, if you like, right? And look, there are exceptions, but on the whole, it's not something that we respond to particularly well.